I will not yield, Britain will not yield on our principles and values about the future of Greenland under threats of tariffs. As we engage constructively, I have made my position clear on our principles and values. The first of those is that the future of Greenland is for the people of Greenland and the Kingdom of Denmark alone. The second is that threats of tariffs to pressurise allies are completely wrong. Mr. Speaker, we will continue to engage constructively. I've had many international calls in recent days, and the Prime Minister of Denmark is coming to the United Kingdom tomorrow for bilateral talks. But I do want to be clear with the House. I will not yield, Britain will not yield on our principles and values.
Imagine living in London knowing that a foreign government has placed £1 million bounty on your head, openly encouraging people to kidnap you and drag you to their embassy. And your own government has just approved plans for that same regime to build a massive new embassy complex right in the heart of the capital. That's not a dystopian thriller plot, that's the reality facing Chloe Cheung, a Hong Kong pro-democracy activist who's watching the British government green-light China's super embassy whilst she walks the streets looking over her shoulder, carrying self-protection devices, because, in her words, the UK police can't do anything to protect me. Welcome to Britain in 2026, where apparently trade deals with authoritarian regimes take priority over the safety of residents who dared to stand up for democracy. Quick favour, if you're loving this deep dive into Britain's troubling China policy, hit that subscribe button and smash the bell icon. Over 94% of you haven't yet. It's completely free, takes 2 seconds, and helps us keep exposing stories the establishment would rather you didn't hear. Cheers if you did. Now, back to this absolute madness. So let's start with Chloe Cheung's story, because it's genuinely chilling and provides essential context for why this embassy approval is so controversial. Cheung was born in Hong Kong and participated in the 2019 pro-democracy protests, those massive demonstrations where millions of Hong Kong residents took to the streets demanding democratic rights and opposing Beijing's increasing control over the territory. Those protests were met with brutal crackdowns, mass arrests, and the imposition of the draconian national security law that criminalized virtually any criticism of the Chinese or Hong Kong authorities. Cheung left Hong Kong in August 2020 because she felt unsafe under that law, which is entirely understandable given what's happened to protesters who stayed. She moved to the UK and continued her advocacy work because, as she puts it, a lot of my Hong Kong friends are still in prison. Think about that for a moment. Her friends are imprisoned for participating in protests, for waving flags, for wearing protest T-shirts. Not for violence, not for terrorism, but for expressing political opinions and demanding democratic rights. That's the regime Britain is now cozying up to with trade deals and embassy approvals. In December 2024, the Hong Kong authorities placed a bounty of $1 million Hong Kong dollars on Cheung's head. That's roughly £100,000 sterling, 6 figures for anyone who can get her to the Chinese embassy. That's not a historical story about Cold War espionage. That's happening right now in modern Britain. The charges against her are colluding with foreign forces and inciting secession, which in plain English means talking to politicians and journalists about what's happening in Hong Kong. Let me repeat that. Talking to politicians and journalists is now considered a crime worthy of a bounty by the Hong Kong authorities operating under Chinese control. Cheung explained it perfectly. It means that if anyone can get me to the embassy, they would get $1 million Hong Kong dollars straight away. They are trying to encourage people to kidnap me. They're trying to encourage people to kidnap her on British soil. And the British government's response to this threat? Approve a massive new Chinese embassy that would make such kidnapping operations even easier to coordinate.
Now, let's talk about this super embassy that's caused such fury. The Chinese authorities want to consolidate their diplomatic operations into a massive building right next to Tower Bridge in central London, not in some quiet suburban location, but right in the heart of the capital, one of London's most iconic locations. Cheung makes two critical points about why this is problematic. First, consolidating every single diplomat into one massive building makes it easier to facilitate transnational repression, spying and surveillance work. That's not a conspiracy theory speculation, that's basic operational logic. If all your intelligence officers, diplomats and security personnel are in one secure location with diplomatic immunity, coordinating operations against dissidents, activists and perceived enemies becomes significantly simpler. Her second point is even more damning of the British government. She argues that Britain's position towards China demonstrates they're willing to sacrifice the safety of UK residents and Hong Kong activists for trade deals with China. That's an absolutely devastating accusation against Sir Keir Starmer's government, and the evidence rather supports it. The timing is extraordinarily suspicious. Starmer is planning a visit to China to secure more trade deals, and suddenly the embassy application that was previously rejected under the Conservative government gets approved. Coincidence? Cheung doesn't think so, and frankly, neither should anyone paying attention. When asked directly if Starmer's upcoming China visit is the main reason for approving the embassy plans, Cheung agreed. I think that's exactly what's driven the embassy decision. She expanded on the broader problems with Britain's approach to China, noting that trade deals aren't just about how much Britain can gain, but also the consequences that come with them. Those consequences include increased dependence on China, intellectual property theft, and vulnerability to economic coercion. These aren't theoretical concerns, they're documented patterns of Chinese economic behavior with Western countries. Australia learned this lesson the hard way when China imposed punishing trade restrictions after Canberra called for an investigation into COVID's origins. Does Britain really want to put itself in a position where criticizing China's human rights abuses or supporting Taiwan could result in economic retaliation? Cheung's assessment of the Labour government's approach to China is particularly scathing and worth quoting in full. She said they're too naive and don't know how to deal with an authoritarian regime. She continued, they never play by the rules, they always violate the law, the rules, and they just do whatever they want. They always weaponize whatever they have for their agenda, and I think Britain must realize that. That's a Hong Kong activist who's experienced Chinese authoritarianism firsthand, telling the British government they're being played. Perhaps they should listen. The naivety Cheung identifies is genuinely concerning. Western liberal democracies, including Britain, tend to assume that other governments operate according to similar norms of international behavior, diplomatic reciprocity, and adherence to rules-based systems. Authoritarian regimes like China don't operate that way. They view diplomacy as an extension of statecraft and intelligence operations. They use trade as a weapon. They exploit the openness of democratic societies whilst maintaining complete control over their own. When Britain approves a massive Chinese embassy in central London, the Chinese authorities don't see that as a generous diplomatic gesture. They see it as weakness and an opportunity to expand their intelligence and influence operations. Now, let's talk about Cheung's friend who's currently in prison in Hong Kong, because his story perfectly illustrates what Britain is dealing with here. He was prosecuted under illegal assembly charges, which means he participated in protests. That's it. No violence, no property damage, just participating in a political demonstration. He's now been in prison for 4 to 5 years. Cheung explains she can't say who he is, but he's now in prison because he waves a flag, he wears a protest T-shirt, and that's what the Hong Kong authorities said. Waving a flag and wearing a T-shirt. That's what passes for serious criminality in the Chinese system, and Britain is approving embassy expansions for the government responsible for this repression. Yet here we are in 2026, still arguing about the fundamental architecture of our relationship with Europe. Every time a minister even whispers the words customs union, it reignites all those Brexit battles that tore communities and families apart. Kyle called it a gentle debate, but there's nothing gentle about Brexit debates in Britain. They're more like gladiatorial combat with statistics and GDP projections as weapons. What makes this situation particularly tricky for Starmer is that he's trying to perform a delicate balancing act. On one hand, he needs to reassure Leave voters, particularly in those red wall seats Labour recaptured, that he's not trying to reverse Brexit by stealth. On the other hand, the economic reality is that Brexit has created trade barriers and economic friction that many businesses find frustrating and costly. So Labour's position seems to be, we're definitely not rejoining the customs union, except we might want to have a gentle debate about it, but anyone who suggests we should is being foolish, unless they're making the point that it would be crazy not to consider it. Clear as mud, right? Kyle's comments about Turkey are particularly interesting. He noted that it took Turkey 20 years to join the customs union with the EU. That timeline is accurate, but it's also slightly misleading. Turkey's journey was complicated by numerous political factors, membership negotiations, and specific arrangements about their relationship with the EU. Britain, having recently been a full EU member with all the institutional knowledge and existing trade infrastructure, wouldn't necessarily follow the same timeline. But Kyle's point seems to be that rejoining wouldn't be quick or simple, which is probably the one thing everyone can agree on. What's fascinating about this whole debacle is how it reveals the internal tensions within Labour about Brexit. During the opposition years, Starmer has been able to maintain discipline on this issue because, frankly, nobody really cared what the opposition thought about Brexit. But now they're in government, with ministers attending international forums and making trade policy, those private disagreements are becoming public contradictions. Some Labour MPs and ministers clearly believe that closer alignment with the EU, potentially including a customs union, is economically necessary. Others believe that reopening Brexit debates would be political suicide. And Starmer is stuck in a middle, trying to keep everyone happy while maintaining those red lines he drew during the election campaign. The timing of this chaos is also rather unfortunate for Labour. They're trying to convince the country that they have a coherent plan for economic growth, that they're the stable, competent alternative to years of Conservative chaos. But when your ministers are publicly contradicting each other and themselves on fundamental economic policy, that stability narrative takes rather a battering. It's hard to convince businesses to invest and plan for the long term when the government can't seem to decide whether it's open to a customs union or considers the idea foolish utopian thinking. Kyle's insistence that he's focusing on what it takes to get growth into the economy now is telling. He's trying to pivot away from the long-term customs union question to immediate growth measures.